Hello, nerds. Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we have author, former journalist, about to go into Hollywood, Margalit Fox. She's talking about her new book, The Confidence Men, which is about to become a major motion picture. We talk about a lot of different things. Margalit has had an amazing career doing a lot of different things, working for the New York Times, among other things. And I had a wonderful conversation with her. Technical note, we did do this conversation over the phone while Margalit was in New York in the middle of a heat wave. So you might hear when she's talking a little bit of a fan sound or anything like that. Sorry, technical stuff. We had to fight through it. We did the best we could. She's so interesting, you're going to forget about it really fast. Just power through. Speaking of which, I'm going to shut up so now you can hear it. Margalit Fox, let's talk to her. All right, welcoming to the podcast, Margalit Fox. Margot, thanks so much for coming on here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right, before we jump into your book, The Confidence Men, your most recent one, which to say it's doing well would be a ridiculous understatement, but we'll get to that. I like to pride myself on being quasi-professional, so I'd like to start off with a little bit of an ambush question. I do my research. I've been watching your Twitter. You just recently said that you were somehow able to get the phrase beastly bloated booby into your new manuscript. Now, the question is, are you willing to add any context for the listeners on that, or do we have to wait for the new book to get anything else?
Well, the answer is yes and no, because you're such a nice guy. I will give you a little hint. Your listeners, of course, being a self-selecting group of history nerds, may know the phrase, or they will know where to find what it refers to. The phrase beastly, bloated booby, is an actual 19th century quote from a crusading newspaperman named Mike Walsh here in New York. And it was about a corrupt 19th century figure. And in the Tammany Hall era, pretty much corrupt and 19th century figure are synonymous. So listeners, go find to whom it refers, and that guy has a cameo appearance in my fifth book, which I'm currently under contract to write now, which is about crime in 19th century New York.
Oh, I can't wait. That is definitely a pre-order. Just speaking of all this, how do you find the time to do everything that you do? I mean, it seems like you're writing in various mediums constantly. You worked at the Times for years, which we'll talk about too. What does your day-to-day look like? Is it just writing wall to wall, or do you just have one project, do that, go on to the next one?
Well, now, mercifully, I have one project, go on to the next one. But for my first three books, which was about 15 years worth of work for all three, I was still working full-time at the New York Times. I was an editor at the Times Book Review for 10 years, and then I was a writer in their famous obituary news department. And after three books, I finally got to the point where I realized if I were very careful, I could go out on my own and just write books. So in 2018, I was by that time a senior writer at the Times. I took early retirement. And since then, my writing life has been much less complicated. Before that, I wrote evenings, weekends, vacations, and it meant I was really tired and had no social life. Now, it's pure pleasure. I spend a year to a year and a half for each of my books just reading the literature before I even touch the keyboard. And so my days for the last 4 years have been sitting in my study, from which I'm talking to you now, with my coffee at my elbow, a cat on my lap, serving obligingly as the book stand, just reading. And then after about a year and a half, I will hit the keyboard and start writing the book. So whereas each of my books took 5 to 6 years to write when I was still at the Times, they now take 2 to 3.
We have to go back and talk about this. The Times, you were in the obituary section. Again, I'd say you did pretty well with it for about 20 years. But I think a lot of people would say obituary section, that's not something you want to do. But I can quote you saying that it was some of the jolliest time that you had. How did you go about looking at the obituary section?
Well, it's reporting the news like any other section of the paper. And yes, there's the widespread misconception that because obits seem to be so bound up with death, that they must be these dark, dour, depressing places to work. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. If you think about a news obit of, say, 1,000 words, maybe 2 sentences are about the death, and the rest of it is very much about the life. Now, some people's lives are wonderful and heroic and celebratory. Others are not. We write, of course, not only about the great heroes of history, but also about the great villains. I've had in my time to write about Nazi war criminals, about some of the worst enforcers of segregation in the Jim Crow South. And you feel terrible. You feel like you want to go home and take a shower and wash that person off you. But you're reporting and writing the news. You have to show your subject warts and all. And again, these are news articles like any other in the paper. They are neither tributes nor condemnatory pieces. We try to do them straight down the line. The section was jolly because my colleagues were jolly. One of my colleagues, the wonderfully named Peter Keepnews, who is still there, is a brilliant semi-professional stand-up comic. So we were laughing all day long. And in a typical American newsroom, we've all seen the movies, your colleagues are sitting 2 feet from you in every direction. So you hear what everybody else is working on in the course of their reporting day. And reporting obits is just not like anything else, because in the course of a given week, you could be called on to do the obit of a famous belly dancer, the deposed president of some obscure country, an underwater cartographer. These are literally all kinds of people I've done. And so I started keeping a tacit list of things that were overheard in the obit section in the course of my colleagues and my reporting day. Now, the list is deeply classified. I still have it. But I'll tell your listeners one thing. This is my favorite thing. The list runs to about 30 pages because I did it for all 14 years I was in the department. My favorite entry is my brilliant colleague, Doug Martin, who's now retired, was on the phone with somebody connected with the person he was writing about. And he said, in all seriousness, so did her friends know she was a spy, or was it something she kind of kept to herself? And that's what life in obits is like. It's never dull.
That does sound like fun, and I'm glad it is, right? Otherwise, that's rough. However, the way I also think about it, too, is there's a lot of pressure there, too, because you may be introducing someone to the readers for the first time, and you're trying to sum up a life. Is there pressure there to that? Because, I mean, especially if it's a long life, you only have so much room on the page, and you have to kind of make a decision yourself, what's important and what's not. Is there a pressure to that?
Well, there's the same pressure as applies in writing a news story on deadline in any beat, whether you're covering Wall Street or the New York Yankees or the Supreme Court or the New York Philharmonic. That's the pressure to get it right, keep it balanced, file by 6 o'clock, because that deadline gun is to your head and the clock is ticking down. With obits, where the pressure comes is, unlike people on all those regular beats, obit is the beat of no beats, where you do have the belly dancer one day and the deposed president or king the next day. So you don't have the mastery of a single subject the way a traditional beat reporter does, and you don't have the bristling Rolodex of experts on that subject. So obit, as one of my colleagues brilliantly said, is instant expert, where you're pretty much learning a whole field from the ground up every day. And it's almost certainly a field you didn't study in college. And so the pressure there is to assimilate enough that you can represent it accurately to readers who may know even slightly less than you.
I'm sure this is going to sound like a weird question, but do you have a favorite obituary?
Gosh, it's like asking about a favorite child, because I did probably between 14 to 1,500 obits in the time I was there. One of the ones I'm particularly fond of is for a guy named Alan Abel, who was a professional hoaxer. And, back in the mid-20th century, one could sort of barely make a living at it. And he was really, really good. But one of the things Alan Abel pulled off was in the early 80s, he hoaxed the New York Times into printing a news obit for him when he was not, in fact, dead. And he was so smart. He knew exactly what our routine would be in terms of checking. He anticipated everything that a reporter would do. He even set up a fake funeral parlor with a fake directory information listing with the phone company. He had friends and Confederates act as the funeral director, the grieving widow. So when whoever the reporter was 40 years ago made the reporting calls in all good faith, Alan Abel was a step ahead every inch of the way. And so now fast forward to the 21st century when Alan Abel is an old man, and my editors told me this is someone we should really have an advance obit for. As you may know, news organizations very often have advance obits pre-written for very famous people whose life is so long, so rich, and so complex that you don't want to get caught short doing it on deadline. Sometimes you do, of course. So with my heart in my mouth, I wrote whatever it was, 1,500 words on the not yet dead Mr. Abel. And then, because I was absolutely terrified of what happens if the family calls us to say he's died, how do we know it's actually true this time? It's a very much a boy who cried wolf situation. So I retired because I didn't want to deal with it and left it in the can. I still have about probably 50, 60 advance obits in the can. They run periodically. And when Mr. Abel supposedly died, maybe a year or two later, I was in retirement. I was blissfully out of it. And so one of my colleagues called and I conferred with him and I said, please be sure to put in the story exactly how we know he was dead. And I had this fantasy of, were I still on the paper's payroll, going to the funeral home, and when the undertaker's back was turned, taking out a hat pin and giving the late Mr. Abel a good jab in the foot with my hat pin to see if he jumped. Indeed, the lead for the obit is the strangest I ever wrote. It said, Alan Abel, a professional hoaxer who blah, 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 apparently actually did die. And we're still waiting for him to rise from the grave and call us and say, I told you so, but so far he hasn't.
Well, I have a new hero, but speaking of hoaxers, which is the most perfect segue I've had in a podcast so far, The Confidence Men. Your latest book, it's out, it's doing gangbusters. How did you even find this story? I mean, we're talking about this is World War I, but also you took a particular area of World War I that is just not very well talked about at all. Do me a favor, just tell me the setting of The Confidence Men and how did you stumble upon it?
Of course. Well, I hate this phrase, but it works well. Here's the elevator pitch. And if I gave this elevator pitch to an editor or a producer, they would think I had gone mental. But it is literally this. In the depths of World War I, two handsome young British officers interned in an Ottoman prison camp escaped by means of a Ouija board. And that is literally what happened. The Ouija board was at the center of an elaborate, meticulously engineered confidence game spun out by our two heroes, Harry Jones, who was a Welsh-born artillery man, and Cedric Hill, who was an Australian flyer. And the two of them separately had been captured in the Ottoman theater, which has often called the forgotten theater of World War I. We all know the Western Front, but nobody thinks about Mesopotamia, where Jones was captured, or the Sinai-Palestine campaign, where Hill was shot down in his biplane. They both wound up in Yozgad, which is a remote prisoner of war camp in the mountains of Anatolia, considered so escape-proof because of the mountains and the Anatolian desert around it that there was actually no barbed wire around the camp. It was just a bunch of houses that were conveniently empty because their Armenian owners had been murdered in the genocide of 1915. So here we have, it's now 1916, 100 British officers are interned in these drafty, now very dilapidated houses. And conditions for a prison camp are okay, but they're crushingly bored. They have nothing to do. One day, Harry Jones, he's about 32, he gets a postcard from an aunt in Britain, and the aunt knows that her nephew and his comrades have these long, empty days with crushing ennui. She suggests that they try experimenting with a Ouija board, which were all the rage then, both as parlor entertainment and, sadly, as kind of the centerpiece of spiritual charlatanism, where you had these supposed spirit mediums going around and taking money from families who'd lost loved ones in the war and were desperate to contact them on the so-called other side. So Jones, purely as a lark, builds a Ouija board unlike any you've ever seen, this sort of circular board built out of scrap material. And he's so clever and is such a leg puller that he starts faking seances for his fellow captives. More and more captives start to believe in the spirit world because Jones has such an acute visual memory. He can actually work the board blindfolded. They're using an inverted drinking glass as the planchette, the little pointer, and he can actually make the glass go to the letters he wants, and he invents all these ghosts. He's no fool. He invents a saucy ghost named Sally who tells all sorts of ribald things to these men that haven't been with a woman in years. And the men have a grand time, so night after night they have these seances that only Jones knows are fake. Months go by, and he finally realizes that his Ottoman captors are just as much believers in the spirit world as his British compatriots. And he thinks, aha, if I can somehow parlay this amusement, this spiritual charlatanism into the centerpiece of a confidence game, and I can reel my captors in, maybe, just maybe, it will open the door to freedom. He joined forces with Cedric Hill, who happened to be a brilliant amateur stage magician, great sleight of hand artist. And that's exactly what you want if you're trying to work a spiritually based con. And so the two of them, working over more than a year, actually created a con game, reeled their captors in. They spun the story of buried treasure, vast riches hidden, well, somewhere in Turkey that would be the captors to share if only they would lead Jones and Hill far away from camp in search of it. And so they literally had a going con where their captors would lead them on the road to freedom, and the Ottoman government would be paying their travel expenses. I mean, how brilliant is that?
Just the stuff you mentioned is crazy stuff, and there's the actual details to it are also insane. You can't believe it. Jones and Hill didn't know each other before this. They get into a life or death game, and they haven't been friends for 20 years. They meet in a prisoner of war camp under the worst of circumstances, and they have to basically immediately trust each other with everything. Like, you know, they weren't always next to each other, which means even when they went off, they had to make sure that their story was always on. I mean, that's almost the most amazing part of it.
Correct. And you couldn't have asked for a better pair in terms of a buddy movie because they couldn't have come from more different backgrounds. Harry Jones, the Welshman, was Oxford educated. He was a lawyer. He was serving as a magistrate in British Burma when the war broke out, and he enlisted in the Indian Army Reserve of Officers and was sent to the Mesopotamian campaign. His father was a knight. His father, Sir Henry Jones, was one of the world's leading moral philosophers. So he was from this erudite upper middle class background. By contrast, Cedric Hill, the Australian, had never been to university. He was a mechanic who was in charge of tending the machinery on a sheep station in Australia, and yet they came to love each other and literally trust each other deeply because, as you say, their lives depended on it.
And I would love to go into every single thing that they had to do, but of course we have to leave some of the book for everyone to read. I do want to ask, Can you pull off a long con the way that they did? I looked at it. I couldn't get away with it. Not for a year, not for the daily things that they had to battle. Because it wasn't just, oh, we did a couple of seances and now they're starting to believe us. It was a day in, day out con. You think you could do that for a year?
No. And as one of the experts on confidence games in general, whom I quote in the book, says, no true con man ever has the day off. Because indeed, you have to have your story straight. You have to be in character. You have to know what's coming next in the con. And in case that blows up, which things have a way of doing, you have to have a plan B, C, D, E, and F at the ready. And so it must be the most stressful life imaginable. So for that reason, I couldn't do it or wouldn't do it, because who needs that level of stress? And also the particular con that they did, where they got masses and masses of people to believe that this homemade Ouija board could actually deliver messages, including messages about buried treasure from the spirit world. As I say at the end of the book, where I talk about how this preposterous sounding plan could actually have worked, it could really have only worked at that moment in time, where because of war deaths, you had a wide resurgence of the spiritualist belief that had been popular in the Victorian age, but by, say, 1900 had started to wane. 1914, of course, it all came back with a vengeance. And it was also a liminal time in world history in terms of communication technology, where suddenly in the last part of the 19th century, you had the emergence of these seemingly miraculous scientific technologies, the telephone, all of these things that defied the ken of most laymen and seemed to people to be born of an almost magical impulse. So it was easier at that historical moment than it would ever be later to have people believe that if you could have disembodied messages fly through the air on this invention called the wireless, why not have them fly through the ether from the world of the dead to the world of the living via a Ouija board as well?
Let's stick with the hypotheticals. If you were forced to do a long con, right, because you dug deep into both of these guys, and you could only have Jones or Hill, which one are you going to pick?
I would abdicate, because that's an untenable proposition. You need them both. And again, that's what makes them such brilliant partners in the con and such brilliant subjects for me as a journalist, because to be a little reductive, Jones was very much the head of the operation. He did all of the planning, all of the logistics, and Hill, who was brilliant with anything mechanical, he could build anything. And when you're in a prison camp, in a remote prison camp in 1916, 17, with limited materials, you have to jury rig every prop that you're going to need out of found objects. So Jones was very much the head, Hill was the hands, and so you couldn't have a con that would work if you just had one or the other.
If I had to, I'd take Hill, because I've never had a bad time with an Australian. I mean, even if you end up dead, it's going to be a lot of fun along the way. That's just my thought.
Yeah, that's entirely possible. In writing the screenplay, because we've been fortunate enough not only to have the book optioned by Thunder Road Films, but my screenplay adaptation was optioned. Of course, to write a proper screen drama, I had to make much more tension between the two of them at the start, and they had to become reconciled to each other in that sort of Butch and Sundance way. And I really like them both, and they both seem like really, really good guys. But I thought, well, Hill is the younger of the two by about 8 years, and he's an Australian. I know, I'll make him really cocky at the outset. And so that's what I did.
That brings me to number one. Congratulations, that's fantastic. Number two, it's a two-part question. Can I be in the movie, and why not?
Well, when my previous book, Conan Doyle for the Defense, was optioned by a different producer, Gold Circle Entertainment, I said to the producer, you have to let me play a little old Jewish lady in a crowd scene, because that book is about the wrongful conviction for murder of a Jewish immigrant in 1908 Scotland, and the conviction was eventually overturned through the personal investigation of Arthur Conan Doyle. So as for The Confidence Men, you would have a better chance of being an extra in the film than I, simply because in an officer's prison camp in World War I, there are no women. So maybe, if you wouldn't mind being clean-shaven, then maybe we could get you in as a captured British officer.
For a movie, I'll shave the beard. I'll do it.
There you go.
A little scruff. You can just put me in the background and put some dirt on my face or something. I can look pretty upset. I can pull it off. I really do.
Absolutely.
Tell me where you were when you find out that it's going to get optioned for a movie. Does it come out of nowhere? Is there tons of talks and everything like that? But as you said with Conan Doyle for the Defense, another book I love, I always hear that you just never know how these things are going to go when it comes down to Hollywood. You'll hear a lot and then you'll hear nothing and you may never again. How did this one come about?
Well, with The Confidence Men, I was very lucky. I spent a very, very happy summer in talks with probably 6 or 8 different production companies that had seen reviews of the book and were interested in picking up the option. So it was a very, very privileged position to be in. But yes, I've been around the block long enough to know that you can have a producer in all good faith tell you all sorts of exciting things about how they want to make a movie out of your book, and then for economic reasons, other practical reasons, these days, because COVID is shutting everything down, nothing happens. Fortunately, I have an agent to take care of all that. And so my screen agent, has been on the job sending the book around to other interested producers. So he's been able to field all that for me. So I'm afraid there was no great drama of my being, roused from my bed with a 4 a.m. phone call from someone on the West Coast saying, we're going to make a movie of your book. It was simply, I was in talks with another producer who was interested, and Basil Iwanek, the head of Thunder Road Films, God bless him, was willing to entertain the thought of my doing the screenplay adaptation. I've been training as a screenwriter for some years with the hope of adapting my own stuff. And so I wrote a full 2-hour film, sent it to Basil. He gave me some very good notes. And when I made his changes, he said, I'm very happy to see that you're not one of these writers that is in love with your own words and you're willing to take notes. And with that, he and my agent hammered out a deal. So a lot of this took place outside of my awareness. So I'm afraid no great moment of dramatic ecstasy, just diligence and patience.
Of course, you shouldn't be too precious with your words or anything like that. But being a history nerd, I get very scared when books that I like are going to become movies, because I'm afraid they're going to get a term that I have coined, Mel Gibson, where they take the actual historical parts and change them all for no reason whatsoever, but keep the name at the end. Now, I don't know what it's like, right? I'm just a reader who falls in love with a book, but this, the book is your baby in a way. Do you get concerned when it's going to go into the Hollywood machine that it's going to come out something completely different than you intended? Or is that something you have to let go and then see what happens from there?
I'm not concerned with this producer, and of course, I know what's in the script because I wrote it. What I did do, and I also requested this for the Conan Doyle adaptation, where there's a screenplay by a terrific young British screenwriter. This is a very subtle change, but it's very liberating. Some movies will say, based on the book by so-and-so. Here, I will have a title card that says, inspired by. And the minute you change from based on to inspired by, I feel that it gave me permission as the adapter of my own work to make a piece of dramatic art that has its roots in the Confidence Men story. But what makes a good piece of journalism just almost never makes a good piece of drama. So there are certain structural things that had to change. There are certain characters that I had to invent. And the rule I made for myself is if there's a real character from the story to whom I have to give lines that he didn't authentically say in history, or to whom I have to attribute actions that he didn't authentically do, I'll give that person a different name. So suddenly it's not that historical figure. Jones and Hill obviously are status quo. And I'm very, very lucky that the minute I first came upon the story, before I wrote a word of the book, the story was heaven sent in that it cleaves naturally into that classic 3-act structure that you want both for a narrative nonfiction book and for a movie. You have the classic Act 1 mise en scène, where you have their arrival at the prison camp, the conditions of acute boredom, the making of the Ouija board. Classic Act 2, the buildup of the con game, the reeling in of the captors, and then, just as you needed to, and this is the amazing thing, there's always a disaster at the end of Act 2. You know, the bank robbers are just about to leave the heist with a bag full of money. They've timed everything perfectly, and suddenly they emerge to find the getaway car is parked in, or it's blown a tire. And indeed, in the real story, just as Hill and Jones are on the brink of liberty with this elaborate treasure hunt, their captors are literally about to lead them far away from the prison camp. Everything goes south. That's all I'll say. The whole plan that they've worked on for over a year blows up. And Act 3, just as you wanted, they have to very, very quickly put in place a desperate, dangerous plan B. So in that sense, it was tailor-made for a movie because the structure was there in the original story.
Now, will you go back to the history at all, even though you've already written it? So when you start writing a script treatment, do you at all go back to the history and say, maybe I'll add this, or do you go straight into, this is almost kind of a novel, right? I'll move it and do it the way I want, or do you still go back to the history and say, I'll sprinkle in what I can. If it makes sense here, expound upon this. Is it just completely two different sets of things in your head, or do you let them still mingle as you're writing?
They mingle, but only to an extent. And again, in this book, I was very, very lucky. There's so much rich documentation of the history. Both Hill and Jones wrote memoirs. Some of the other prisoners in the camp wrote their memoirs. And what a number of interviewers have asked me quite reasonably is, these guys were these brilliant hoaxers. How do you know that you, 100 years later, weren't hoaxed? How do you know this really happened? And I say, aha, that's a necessary question, and it's the first one I asked myself at the outset as a journalist. I very fortunately found in short order memoirs by several other British officers who were interned with them at Yozgad, who write, just in terms of describing daily life there, write about going to these seances, which, as far as they knew, were just for fun. And then they'll say, only after the war did I learn what the true function of these seances were, how they helped Jones and Hill escape. So here we had independent corroboration by primary sources. It couldn't have been better. So the story as a whole, among all these memoirs, is so well documented that if I found I needed something for the screenplay to make the plot go where I needed it to go, to give a little breath between scenes, I could almost always go back to the real history and find it. I did have to invent dialogue. I had to make up certain things. Jones, when he first starts tricking his compatriots with the saucy wench, Sally the ghost, he was born in the Victorian age. He's too much of a gentleman to put in black and white in his memoir the salacious things she said to get all the men involved. Boy, did I have a good time making that stuff up. And of course, it's not what was actually said. I'm not in Jones's head, but it serves. It will read as eminently reasonable period dialogue from that age-old situation, a captive conjuring up a saucy wench of a ghost to con his friends in a remote prison camp. Piece of cake.
Now, what is not a piece of cake is Hollywood. I want to know, which of these things do you think has prepared you more for the rigors of Hollywood? Working in newspapers or being from Long Island?
Well, it's very, very early days. COVID as it has slowed or shut down every industry, has taken a great toll on the Hollywood timetable in terms of the speed of things getting done. So I'm really at very early stages with the options for both of these books. And of course, as I well know, an option doesn't mean a film will ever get made. So it's not a question I can answer yet, because I'm still at the stage where I'm not that involved. All I have to do is sign option agreements and sit back and wait for stuff to happen. So it's too soon for me to know.
Oh, I'm going to check back in on that, though. I'm definitely going to check back in on that. Last question. I really like asking this. History Nerds United was founded because a lot of people overlook history. They remember it from high school or from grade school where it's boring and I don't want to learn it again. And I've already learned about the Revolutionary War 4,000 times. We were founded to show those people that there's still a lot of fun history to learn about. If you met one of those people who said, I don't want to read anything that's history, what would you say to them about why they should read The Confidence Men?
Because it's the most preposterous story. It sounds like the product of some demented fever dream in an opium den. Two guys escaping from a POW camp, not by tunneling, not with weapons, not with any violence, but with a Ouija board. And hey, guess what? It's all real. I can't think of a better advertisement for history than that, with the secondary benefit that you're getting an arena that was doubly marginalized. We all read and see movies about World War II prisoner escapes. Plenty of World War I prisoners escaped. Some of them even wrote memoirs, yet those histories from the Great War are much less well known. And then we also have not the Western Front, but the action taking place in the East, the Ottoman theater, much less well known. So I was very pleased and proud to be able to revisit this story 100 years later for those reasons as well.
Well, Margot, you certainly sold me, and I had already read it. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode. Margot, thank you so much. The Confidence Men. Read the book, then watch the movie as soon as it comes out. In the meantime, search us out on social media. Head over to the History Nerds United blog. Check out our Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, wherever you can find us. Shoot us emails. Tell us what you like. Tell us what you want more of. We'll do it. I promise. For the most part. Don't ask for something weird. Anyway, until next time, be safe, nerds.